Hello everyone, thank you for subscribing in this international law channel in YouTube. We talk about the international business, we talk about the due diligence, anti-corruption, compliance, and now international security with Martin Arostegui. Martin Arostegui is a renowned and highly experienced journalist specializing in military and intelligence matters, who has covered the kind of international conflict we are now seeing deploying in Ukraine. He has worked for Voice of America, he worked with Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Times, CNN, Fox News, United Press International, and France 24. And he's author of the book about military special operation called Twilight Warriors. Thank you for subscribing. Continue this Sunday special edition with Ukraine. Hi guys, how are you?
Hi Christian, how are you? How are things? Glad to be on board. We've been devoting, of course, in view of the events around the world, to talking about what is happening in this in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is an event that's going to change, or could conceivably change, much of what happens in the world in the area of business, trade, and law, and a lot of other things. So let me begin by giving you an update on what's happened since we last spoke, since a week ago. As I more or less predicted, Russia's inability so far to capture any significant territory in Ukraine has been leading to a redoubling of efforts, or an increase of the intensity and violence in its assault on civilian population, because since they cannot score a direct military victory, I mean decisive military victory against the Ukrainians, who are resisting with incredible resilience, whose special forces and army and civilian militia appear highly trained as well as motivated, against a Russian force that appears not very well supplied, not highly disciplined, and to some extent demoralized, due in fact to the resistance that's developing, which contradicts the image they were given by their top commander that they would encounter. They are targeting, we're having these terrible sites of the Russians targeting civilian population in an increasingly intensified, violent way. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings are direct targets of missile and airstrikes, and with a devastating effect, of course, on the population. There are massive amounts of refugees. We're now talking about 2 million Ukrainian refugees leaving, pouring into Poland and other neighboring countries. And of course, we have the awful situation of mounting civilian casualties, which are now, in fact, there are no specific figures. They're now in thousands upon thousands. The commission of war crimes by Putin and his army is mounting. So far, according to some analysts, we haven't seen the worst of it. When he does try to take Kiev, which appears imminent, the Russian forces are now pushing up to near, within 10 kilometers of the center. A lot of fighting is already being reported in the right within the outskirts of the city center. Then is when the Russians are expected to resort to extremely two weapons of mass destruction. Talking about thermobaric bombs, which we discussed last time, which have a kind of sort of a virtual nuclear type effect. They're bombs which are activated by a fuel that sucks up oxygen, creating an explosion, a massive explosion that takes out buildings and people over a very large area. And it vaporizes bodies, it sucks the oxygen out of people. It's considered a weapon of mass destruction. Its use is largely forbidden. The Russians have admitted to using cluster bombs already in some civilian areas. And there is the ever-present possibility, although this hasn't happened yet, about the use of chemical weapons and conceivably maybe even tactical nukes, small nuclear bombs. It can be fired from artillery, they don't have to be delivered by air. And it's very much feared that Putin will resort to these extremes. Since we last spoke, Russia has expanded both the scope and of its attacks, as well as throughout Ukraine, as well as managed to expand somewhat its perimeters, the perimeters his army holds over the key targets, the mainly targeted cities of its offensive. Mainly Kiev, the capital in north, and Mariupol, the city in the south on the Black Sea, which would, of course, give Putin a much needed corridor that he wants to form between Crimea, which is controlled by Russia, has been since 2014, and the Donbass region, where the separatist pro-Russian militants want to create a separate republic, which Russia has moved to recognize. In addition to that, Russia is now, over the past 48 to 24 hours, Russia has initiated missile strikes in Western Ukraine against training and supply bases of the Ukrainian army and of the Ukrainian resistance. Mainly a center in the city of Lviv, which has served as one of the main training areas and something that operates as a kind of headquarters of the Ukrainian army, and particularly the special forces groups, which are proving key in the resistance and the ongoing resistance, which continues to be fierce and highly effective. The Russian casualties are now estimated by, and if I may go on slightly to the importance of the targeting of these areas in Western Ukraine. The city of Lviv is the center, this training center, Ukrainian Army Training Center, which is in Lviv, is just a few miles away from the Polish border. So the possibility that Russian missiles could stray into Polish territory could possibly trigger a response by NATO. Poland is NATO territory, and the US and other NATO powers have made it very, very clear that any attack on NATO would be considered an act of war by Russia. So right now, the conflict probably stands at its most critical threshold. Russian casualties are mounting. It's difficult to say with exactitude what they are because there are differing estimates. Russia still puts them as rather low, in the hundreds. Ukrainian estimates are at about over 10,000, which I think is probably inflated. Possibly the Pentagon estimate may be the most realistic, which puts casualties at about 4,000. To give you an idea of this, this is, if this is indeed the figure, this is equivalent to all, in 2 weeks, Russian casualties in Ukraine are equivalent to the total American casualties, fatalities, killed, I'm not talking about wounded, in Iraq during its several years of occupation. So it gives you an idea of the extent of fighting, the extent of resistance being waged against the Russian army. Russia appears to be, aside from the supply problems, which are perhaps now getting straightened out to some extent after 2 weeks of serious logistical strain, which is considered the reason why they have not been able to move as fast as planned to encircle Kiev in the north and take Mariupol in the south, which remains still, although heavily punished by Russian bombardment, still is not under Russian control. There are also signs of severe, there continue to be signs of a morale problem among Russian forces. This is evident among Russians that have captured, some who have even deserted to the Ukrainian side. And there was information yesterday. I have not been able to confirm this, but there was some serious information yesterday that 600 Russian Marines had refused orders to land, perform an amphibious landing in Odessa, which is Ukraine's main port at the west of Crimea, and of course, ultimately a key Russian target. It's been blockaded by the Russian Navy now for over a week, but no amphibious landing has taken place. And this appears to be the reason. I suspected this was the reason a while ago, and it has been confirmed, if the information is true, that the Russian Marines who are supposed to head the amphibious landing have refused orders to do so. We don't know if this is indicative of a larger, or I would say this probably is indicative of a larger malaise among the Russian forces. If this is happening with 600 Russian Marines, which is supposedly an elite unit, one wonders how this might be repeated among the other infantry regiments in Ukraine. Apart from that, there are reports that Putin has ordered the arrest of the head of his secret service, the FSB, as well as his deputy. In other words, he decapitated the FSB, presumably because they didn't give him a very precise information, or they misinformed about the situation in Ukraine, or perhaps because he considered them no longer reliable. There have been reports that the FSB has been leaking information to some of the resistance units. Furthermore, I mean, this isn't just limited, apparently, it isn't just a limited arrest or enforcement effort by Putin. There seems to be part of a growing purge of the FSB, of agents that he no longer considers reliable. There have been reports of raids of the homes of 20 FSB officers in Russia over the past few days, since the head and deputy head of the secret police organization were arrested. And this is the core of his regime. I mean, the FSB is what Putin's regime is all about. The FSB is its forerunner with the KGB, where Putin made his entire career, and his regime has been very much based around the loyalty and the operational control that the Secret Service gave Putin on Russia, as well as the Russian armed forces, which is where the Soviet system of having commissars, Communist Party commissars, Putin has supplanted with having FSB officers operating at tactical level, with tactical units, to keep him personally informed of what happened. So if he can no longer trust the FSB, this, I think, points to possibly a very serious erosion of his authority in the Russian security services. So I think that the only way that Putin can lose this war is if his army turns against him, if the security services turn against him. And something of this appears to be developing. If the Ukrainians can continue the resistance to the point that the Russian army becomes completely demoralized, that they are unable to conduct, to be able to take Kiev in house-to-house combat, which would, the only way he can possibly hold Kiev. I mean, he can bombard it all he wants. He can bombard it back to the Stone Age, which he's threatening to do. But ultimately, he has to take that city. And it will require a highly motivated and well-supplied force to conduct house-to-house fighting in a very, very large urban area. And there are serious doubts as to whether his army can do this. And if his army isn't capable of doing this, the possibility seriously arises that the army could turn against him and his security services could turn against him. And there are any indications that this could be happening. So it's all at a very critical edge right now. It's all on edge. It's both sides, of course, are hurting. I mean, the Ukrainians aren't in great shape either. The resistance forces are all in siege. I mean, it's very difficult, it's increasingly difficult to supply them from the West. And Putin is now increasingly to target their supply lines. It's at a very critical juncture.
That's true, really interesting perception. Now we talk about the Ukrainian strategy in urban warfare. It's a long time, 2 weeks in this war. Is it possible continue to fight with Russia in this strategy in urban warfare?
Well, I think the Ukrainians, I mean, so far casualties probably aren't that large. I mean, you're talking about so far, in relation to the rest of the army. The Ukrainians say 1,500, 300, 500 of their men have been killed. That may be less than actually have been killed, but anyway, there don't seem to be reports of any casualties, a level of casualties which paralyzed the army, which is over 100,000. To that, of course, you've got to add the very vast civilian militia and a foreign legion of volunteers from around the world who have signed up to fight with the Ukrainians. At the latest count, you're getting 16,000 foreign volunteers have arrived to fight with the Ukrainians. All of them, a lot of them are highly trained troops. I mean, you have one unit of ex-US Navy SEALs, which is apparently a key unit are fighting in the outskirts of Kiev, holding the Russians back, holding back the Russian advance. You've got a lot of volunteers, ex-members of the French Deuxième Rep, the parachute regiment, the elite parachute regiment of Foreign Legion. A lot of them whom are Eastern Europeans, by the way, a lot of whom may be Russians. A lot of them are recruited or joined the Deuxième Rep. And they would be very highly acclimatized to the area, and of course, be very highly familiarized people they're dealing with and the kind of fighting that's going on. So there is no lack of recruitment, no lack of enthusiasm, no lack of fodder going into the Ukrainian war machine in terms of human capital. But what they are probably critically low of, or must be running low in certain areas, certainly Mariupol, which is very besieged, which is totally cut off, is supplies. I mean, they probably must be running out. A lot of the pockets of resistance are running out of javelin missiles, which have proved decisive in the fighting against Russian armor, possibly ammunition, and a variety of other anti-tank and anti-aircraft, very importantly, anti-aircraft weapons, Stinger missiles, and a variety of other man-held anti-aircraft systems that the Ukrainians have been given in very large numbers, but which of course run out. And the keeping the Ukrainians supplied with this, especially if the Russia's going to start targeting now in a more systematic way, it's supply routes coming in from Western Ukraine, where the armaments are being shipped across the border from Poland and other neighboring countries. That is probably the main challenge at the moment for the resistance. There is another area, of course, Christian, which is so far we haven't touched on, which is and another factor in the long-term waiting game, if this war drags on for months or even years, which is the sanctions that the West has clamped down on Russia, which are draconian. I mean, they are the most comprehensive and draconian sanctions that the United States and Europe have ever imposed on any regime in the world, in history. The banks, most banks, although a few remain, have been excluded from the SWIFT system, which does not allow the transfer of international transfers of certainly reserve currency, major world currencies into accounts in those banks. Most Western companies have pulled out of Russia, disinvested Russia. A few are left, but most have pulled out. I mean, for example, I mean, one of the mainstays of the Russian industrial economy was the investment by Mercedes in Germany, increasing investment in car manufacturing plants in Russia. In fact, at one point, it seemed that Mercedes can transfer all of its car manufacturing operations to Russia. This, of course, has stopped. They've shut down their plants. They pulled out and pulled out all their investments and all their personnel. So this is just an indication of the extent to which this must be totally crippling and downgrading Russia's efforts to become an industrialize, to become an industrial power. But I mean, this is a double-edged sword, and it's in fact there's been an increasing speculation on the part of some very serious analysts, including a leading analyst of the U.S. Army War College, Professor Evan Ellis, who recently wrote a paper giving his view that as Russia becomes disinvested, as its economy is downgraded to that of a third world status, it will become increasingly dependent on China, and which is playing, which is now Russia's only, even a seemingly reluctant partner. It is, in fact, China could start treating Russia as it does a lot of its third world clients, that in return for basic financing to keep the infrastructure going, to keep the bureaucracy going, to keep the military going, which Russian, as an outlet for Russian banks. I mean, the Russian banks are now begging Chinese banks to conduct international business operations for them, to provide credit for to bring in imports, to trade Russian gold on the Shanghai exchange, this kind of thing. China becoming Russia's only outlet to the rest of the world, or main outlet. That China will begin to treat Russia as it does a third world client state. And now, you know, the level that it does with Africa or Venezuela. And that China will, in return for the financial and investment services it provides Russia, it will gain control of Russia's oil, of Russia's energy and commodities, which of course are very substantial. Russia has some of the highest, as we all know, largest oil deposits, mineral reserves, and agricultural commodities in the world. I mean, it's one of the major wheat producers. It's one of the major nickel producers. All commodities which are now, of course, becoming very, very expensive. The price is shooting up in international exchanges. So the more that Western sanctions bite Russia, the more Russia will become dependent on China, and the more leverage China will have on Russia, and the more control they will exercise on Russia's commodities and energy production. And this is very, very important moving on, going forward. Now, what the West is getting, what the price, to what extent the West is damaging Russian economy, absolutely, very, very seriously. The Russian people are feeling it. But it was interesting in a talk that the ex-head of MI6 recently gave at Oxford University. He says, you know, very, very dry terms, that however potent weapons sanctions may be, they cannot be expected to have full impact for 1 or 2 years. So to the extent that the sanctions could actually impact the ability of Russia's government to operate, it's a very, very long wait. I mean, we're talking, he said 1 or 2 years. And of course, we all know that sanctions, as far as causing regime change, have never been very effective. I mean, we can think of a lot of sanctioned countries everywhere in the world to get rid of very nasty regimes, where they've had very, very little effect. I mean, they're still there. The country's been impoverished. The people have suffered. Yes, their economic strength has been damaged, but I mean, Maduro is still in power in Venezuela. The Ayatollah is still in power in Iran, and in fact, the communist government is still in power in Cuba after half a century of sanctions. And in fact, the only case I can think of in which sanctions were effective was in South Africa back in the 1980s. And that was a very special case. The South African government was, their economic establishment was very intertwined, was very dependent. It was very identified with the Western, European, and American financial and economic system, highly compromised. So the regime in South Africa could not survive in their sanction policy for very long, which led, of course, to the move to eliminate apartheid and hold democratic elections. So the idea of the sanctions on their own are going to topple Putin, I think, are possibilities very remote, and in fact, it may have the effect of driving Russia into a closer dependency of China. I would add that there's also a limit to how sanctions are being applied. In fact, I just read a very interesting report about the way in which the British, which are supposedly forefront of pushing for international sanctions. The British government, Britain has become, of course, well known, notorious for the extent, the extent to which a lot of Russian oligarchs, a lot of Putin's oligarchs, people who've made their vast wealth from being associated or working for Putin's regime. If England has become a haven through very generous, through British laws that allow offshore tax-exempt companies to invest in the UK with very little control, without even having to identify the owners of the company. Russian oligarchs, it's estimated that 120 Russian oligarchs own prime properties in London. Top of the line.
Incredible.
Mansion.
Oligarchy. Yeah.
Properties of, costing tens of millions of dollars, which has been a main source of laundering money. I'll give you an example. I mean, a luxury London mansion owned by the daughter of Lavrov's, Foreign Minister Lavrov's mistress, right? A 17-year-old girl owns one of the most expensive mansions in London, who is the daughter of the mistress of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. This is how they've been laundering money into Russia, massive amounts of Russia. And so far, although the British are introducing legislation to crack down on this, and it calls for the targeting of the property, confiscation of oligarchs' property, they have so far only confiscated 23, or I think even launched investigation, 23 of 120 Russian oligarchs who own major properties in London. So this is how slowly it is going. And even the legislation being proposed that would allow for far larger investigations into the origins of the money that has been invested in the London property market. There's, according to an analysis of this, that is still it's still possible to do it through offshore companies without necessarily identifying this. So this is what this is what we're up against. While the Russian people are suffering from the sanctions already, massive unemployment, the ruble is dropping to nothing, being highly depreciated. The rich oligarchs around Putin are seen to be, a lot of them seem to be relatively unscathed.
That's unacceptable in this moment. The oligarchy continue with the economic, the people, Russia people, in this case is the victim of Ukraine. It really is not justice. We remember the case of the BP Security. You remember, or a case in the investigate their offshores.
Yes, I think what was happening right now with the sanctions, I think definitely it's a case of how much due diligence, the type of thing that your firm and other law firms that are part of your network conduct, is very much needed now. In fact, I think that obviously there's going to be a growing demand for this because of the increasing pressure on Western governments to battle, to undermine Russian investments in the West and limit the extent to which Russian funds can be laundered into investments. Now, aside, of course, from this Russian example, the extent to which due diligence, a case that I've come across, that we've come across, in which a lack of due diligence led to a very serious loss on the part of an American family estate, is of course this case of BP, and I think it's very illustrative of what could happen elsewhere. As we know, as I think we've commented before, in Switzerland right now there is a criminal a criminal lawsuit is in progress. It hasn't, I don't think charges have yet been formally filed, but from sources directly involved in the investigation against a company in Panama called BP Securities, which laundered, well, we can't use the term laundered yet because that has not yet been proved, but essentially invested a $7 million, put a $7 million investment, which it was contracted to manage, into a lot of just dead investments, into a lot of companies which were either insolvent, delisted from the stock exchange, and some of which were even sanctioned by the U.S. government.
PDVSA.
I think the Odebrecht, the Brazilian Odebrecht. And yes, two companies in Argentina, which were virtually bankrupt at the time that this company invested money in them. Now, any due diligence which had been made into this operation would have revealed that BP Securities was a highly suspect vehicle for investment. That it included people on its board who had been involved in formed part of a syndicate of companies involved in various money laundering deals through interlocking members of the board of BP Securities, and were also on the board of several companies which have been involved, which have been investigated in the Panama Papers and other international scandals involving political corruption. And payment of bribes and so on to officials in various Latin American countries and elsewhere around the world. And but still, the man, the financial advisor to Shang Dynasty, which was the family estate which made channels investment through BP, did nothing to investigate or supposedly get any background on BP Securities before channeling the $7 million, throwing $7 million their way, leading to speculation that this financial advisor, again, a very respected, very slick, supposedly very respectable lawyer and financial money banker who worked with Amro's Bank in Holland, who sat on the boards of various companies, including one company I looked up, which included some top-level members of the U.S. defense establishment, biotech, if I recall the name correctly. Reino van Lennep was the name of this financial advisor to Shang Dynasty that advised them or drew up a contract with BP Securities, leading to speculation that he may have been in some way, he may have done this quite deliberately. I mean, this hasn't been proved, but there is reason to assume that he was channeling a lot of money down the way of BP Securities, knowing the unreliability of this company. In fact, it's known that he went to school, or no, not that went to school, but he started out. He worked, I think, at Chase Manhattan Bank with the head of many years ago. Started his career many years ago with the man who is now the head of the securities, Alejandro Allende. Allende, an Argentine banker. So this is what happens when you don't do due diligence. I mean, you assuming that Mr. Van Lennep is innocent of having done of any malfeasance on his part. The suspicion that he may have been, that he could have done this deliberately, is something that could well ruin his the future of his career. And the failure of Chiang Dynasty, perhaps not to contract an independent assessment of BP Securities, maybe through an independent law firm or through an independent investigative service. Also, I mean, is a factor which has resulted in their unfortunate loss of their entire, what seems to be their entire estate.
That's the due diligence we do. We work in this case with the principal responsible is Allende. I remember that. He lived in Buenos Aires, and maybe the justice continued with the investigate in this case. Thank you so much. That's the conclusion.
The last I've heard, by the way, is that Mr. Van Lennep was recently in Argentina, has been there for quite some time, presumably meeting or conducting more operations with Mr. Allende, presumably.
That's true. For conclusion, Martin, that is the end of this meeting in this Saturday special, Sunday, sorry, this Sunday. For conclusion, thank you, Martin. Thank you for subscribe.
Thank you, Christian. Wonderful to talk to you as usual, and see you next Saturday.
See you
next weekend.
Next weekend, that's true. Thank you.
Sure. Bye.
Bye. Sharing, subscribe this YouTube International Law. Bye. See you later.